Today we're focusing on chapter 28, which has to do with my least favorite character in all of Scripture, and that's Jacob. I have not liked Jacob since I was a child. And one punishment that I had as a child that my grandmother gave was if I was disobedient, sometimes I'd have to read the letters of Paul, which I thought were very boring. Now I love them. But if she really wanted to get at me, she had me read the story of Jacob. So I do not like Jacob. But I love God's grace in the story. And so I'm going to, as always, there are two questions I'm going to answer, seek to explore and seek to answer for you. The first is, why is Jacob so bad? Why is he so bad? And then the second is, how does Jacob get right? Why is Jacob so bad? And then how does Jacob get things right? How does he get right? So starting off, why is Jacob so bad? Well, in the stories of the patriarchs that we talked about last week, things do not get better over time. There's this view among Christians that the patriarchs slowly get better. A father, Abraham really messes up, and then it looks like Isaac, he sins less than his father, but they actually don't get better with time. In fact, with each father of Israel, things get progressively worse. First, Abraham. You remember Abraham, he exploits his wife, Sarah, in two different kingdoms, in two different countries. And then he exploits Sarah's servant, Hagar, to conceive a son, Ishmael. He then sends Hagar off while she's pregnant into the wilderness. You remember that story? And then later, when Sarah has Isaac, he sends Hagar off with Ishmael. He sends her off again with Ishmael, and they never come back. And he sends her off into the dangerous wilderness. In short, Abraham misuses women for his own selfish benefit, for his purposes. And he abandons children, which I think makes him a deadbeat, selfish dad. After this, there's Isaac. And Isaac, you think, would learn from his father's mistakes, but Isaac, he exploits Rebekah. And the crazy thing is Rebekah was brought in to give him comfort. His mother had just died, and so Abraham says, I want you to get married. And Rebekah comes in, and the first thing she does as his wife is comforts him with the grief of his mother. And how does he repay her? Well, he exploits her the same way his father exploited his mother. He almost marries her off to a Canaanite king named Abimelech, just like his father. You remember the second king that Abraham brings Sarah to, says, she's my sister? It was also a Canaanite king named Abimelech. So Isaac tries to repeat what his father does with the same group of people and probably in the same kingdom. He shows up. And when this fails, God has to step in, and God rescues him. And it seems to make Isaac change. You remember, the king says, okay, go to Gerar, get out of here and go. And he basically sends him into the wilderness to, he and his people, to die of thirst. And what does Isaac find there? He finds conveniently a well that his father Abraham had put there. And then the Philistines had stopped up the well. And so Isaac removes the cover and the well somehow works again. So God steps in, and you think that experience would change Isaac, and it does. Nevertheless, Isaac has another problem. He has twin sons, and he and his wife start to play favorites. He favors the older one, and his wife favors the younger one. And instead of keeping things in line, he just goes along with it. He favors the older twin, as said before, while Rebekah favors the younger twin. And perhaps this made the younger twin resentful of his older brother. So when Isaac is old and he's blind, the text says the younger brother tricks him. And Isaac gives away the blessing of the older son that he favors. In the end, like Abraham, Isaac misuses women for the benefits, and he abandons children in a worse way than Abraham does. Because here's the thing. He allows the older son, who the text says, it's okay. Oh, thank you. He allows the older son, and the text says that his older son is responsible and upright, hardworking. He allows the older son to end up as the servant of the younger son, who's a scumbag and a schemer. Indeed, Isaac ends up worse off than his father. But the younger son, named Jacob, is the worst of all the patriarchs. He does some awful things that make his story beyond scandalous. But somehow God has to show up again and shows him grace and works to change his character. And it takes a long time for Jacob's character to change. If you remember, his older brother Esau was responsible. He had an upright character, and that made his father love him even more. It wasn't just he was the oldest son. Esau starts off, he's the golden boy of the family. He's working hard. He also, he's bringing gifts to Isaac. Isaac loves wild game. And so what does Esau do? Like any good son, he sees his father is old and blind, and he's grateful for all his father's done, loves his father. So he goes out and he's hunting wild game, and he's trekking for hours, sometimes with no food, just to bring his father back the things that he loves. Esau, he's a hard worker who earns his keep, again through hunting. And this made him the perfect heir to lead and guide the family. So you're expecting the next patriarch to be Esau. He fits the bill. He's the older son. He's hardworking. He honors his father. His father loves him. And also it kind of looks like a reversal with the Isaac and Ishmael thing. Remember, Isaac's the younger brother, and he becomes the heir, and Ishmael gets cheated and gets cast aside, in a way. And also even Lot might have been Abraham's original heir and had been raised to take over the family fortune. And Lot gets pushed aside for Isaac. And now we think, okay, things are going to be in order now with this family. The oldest son is upright, and he's the golden boy, and he does well. So he is going to be the next patriarch. But God has other plans. Going on to Jacob from the beginning is a mooching opportunist. And he starts out doing this from his birth. The day he's born, he's mooching. He's holding on. When he comes out, the text says, Esau's born first, and Jacob is holding on to his heel. The name Jacob actually means, and you have to wonder too, his parents intentionally name him this. Jacob is not a positive name. Jacob means heel grabber, supplanter, usurper, trickster, scammer, schemer. And when he's born, he's holding on to his older brother's heel, his older brother's ankle. He's born, as one pastor said, he's born dead weight, in a sense, just holding on. And one day his mother, Rebecca, gets a very shocking promise. We don't know how, but somehow God tells her, Jacob have I loved, and Esau have I hated. And this part, I'm looking going, God, what are you doing? The scammer, the schemer. How can you love this guy? But God tells her, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And so this means that Jacob will be the next patriarch. He will be the rightful heir. So Rebecca decides, you remember how Sarah says that she needed to help God, and that's how Ishmael was born, and that created drama. Rebecca repeats her mother-in-law's mistake and creates an even worse situation. See, Ishmael was, from a different mother, and Ishmael could just go off and, do his own thing and didn't bother anybody. She now splits her family with what she does. She brings tension into her own house. She tells Jacob, she says, you need to trick your father. She helps him to trick Isaac. She tells her younger son to dress up like his brother. Esau was very hairy, had a lot of body hair. So Jacob puts the skin of goats on his arms. And when Esau would come to Isaac, Isaac could tell who was who by feeling his son's arm. So he feels Jacob's arm and he thinks it's Esau. I also think, to add a little color to the story, Jacob might have changed his voice, might have deepened his voice to sound like his brother. And it works. Isaac falls for it. And so then what happens is that Isaac gives Jacob the blessing. Isaac gives Jacob the inheritance. But what Rebekah doesn't know is that Jacob was already ahead of her. He had already taken from his brother through a scam. Esau, the story. Before the trick, Esau was out working hard, getting wild game to bring to his father. He's out hunting, being responsible, and being upright, being a good son. And he doesn't catch anything, and he's hungry. And so Jacob is cooking some lentil soup, and any good brother would just share his food, but Jacob says, oh, I'll give you food. Jacob takes advantage of his brother when he's hungry. And he says, I'll give you food. I know you're starving, but I'll feed you if you give me your birthright. And we think that Esau is foolish, but you have to understand that Esau was really in a vulnerable state to give that up for a bowl of beans. He scams his own brother when his brother is vulnerable, and then he scams his father. And Rebekah has no idea. Indeed, Jacob was a mooching opportunist. And when Esau learns what he's done, well, he's rightly angry. He's fuming. He wants to kill him. So Jacob, what does he do? He goes to mom. Mama, help me. And so what does she do? She sends him to his uncle. And there he hides for several years while Esau cools down. The story is like this. Imagine the founder of a company leaving all of his assets to a reckless, spoiled, drug-addicted son who runs it in the ground. One colleague of mine says that Jacob and Esau are like, it's an American comparison, they're like Bo and Hunter Biden. You've got the older son who's responsible. Esau is Bo and Jacob is Hunter Biden. And Isaac leaves the family business, leaves everything to him. Everything in this story is so unfair. That's why it makes me so mad. And it's supposed to make you mad. It's supposed to leave the reader angry. And it doesn't stop there. It keeps on. This is just the beginning, the introduction. Once you get into the story, it just keeps getting worse. And there's more scams and there's more scheming. First, Jacob, what does he do? He marries two sisters, Leah and Rachel. He was tricked, so that part I like, when Laban, his uncle, tricks him, I'm like, serves you right, He gets tricked back. But then what does he start doing? He favors Rachel and looks upon Leah with contempt. No matter what Leah does, he cannot seem to love her. And he does the same with all of her children and the one daughter that she gives him. And what he does to the daughter is horrible. For example, what happens is, this story, he lets her go out unprotected. She goes to get water, and in those days, women did not go alone. They went in groups. You still see this in the Middle East today. They went in groups to the well, and there might be some men to go to guard them. Because going to fetch water in those days, a woman was extremely vulnerable. Well, the story says that Jacob's daughter goes by herself. And any father at that time would say, what are you doing going out alone? But he lets her go. And then suddenly a Canaanite prince comes along, kidnaps her, violates her, and then kidnaps her. Well, instead of fighting back, Jacob says, okay, let's have a wedding. He lets the monster keep her. And so then her brothers, have to make a plan and risk their lives to save her. So they say to the Canaanite prince, they say, all right, you can marry our sister, but first you must be circumcised. And so all the men in the castle must be circumcised. And all your servants, everybody. And so these guys, they do it. And then Leah's sons, they come in and kill all of them. They commit regicide, killing a royal family to help their broken sister. While Jacob just lets things go and doesn't care for his daughter. This is far, far beyond what Abraham and Isaac have done. Jacob is feckless. He's low down. He's dirty. He's scheming. He's rotten. He's a selfish parent. He's the worst parent of all time. So again, Jacob leaves his daughter unprotected. And then the same is true for his son Joseph from his second wife, Rachel. See, we often say that Joseph, was this spoiled brat that got himself into trouble, made his brothers jealous, but that's not the case. The text doesn't say that at all. Actually, it's Jacob trying to prop his son up. And the text seems to indicate that Jacob wants a repeat. Because remember, his oldest son, the rightful heir, is by Leah. I think it's Reuben is the oldest son. And so it seems that Jacob is trying to say, all right, son, I stole from Uncle Esau, and now you're going to steal from your older brother. He tries to set Joseph up. He puts his own son in the line of fire for his selfish purposes. And what happens to Joseph? Joseph ends up becoming a slave in Egypt. Abraham and Isaac both played favorites with their sons. This is moving us into the next question. You've seen how bad Jacob was, but how does Jacob get right? Well, Abraham and Isaac both play favorites with their sons, but Jacob goes beyond them and plays favorites with two families. Nevertheless, throughout his story, God begins to change him bit by bit, slowly. And it's not an easy task for God. And at the end, we find a man far different than the moocher. First, after leaving home to hide with his brother, Jacob gets a promise through a dream he has at Bethel. Bethel means the house of God. So it's a very sacred space. And in that dream, he hears this from God. He hears, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. What? What? You're with him? You'll watch him wherever you go? Come on. And it says, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So now you have to accept that even though Jacob got it the wrong way, he's in the right place. Shockingly, he learns that even with his awful scheming, the will of God is that he is the rightful heir of Isaac. He is the next patriarch. And then later on, he meets the Lord in the desert. And after wrestling with him and not giving up, he gets a new name. No longer is he the heel grabber, the trickster, the supplanter, the usurper. He's now called Israel, which means to fight or contend with God. What I love about the story when Jacob wrestles with God is, he's on his way to reconcile with Esau. He says, all right, he gets word, your brother's not angry. And so he sends some servants to sort of scout out. Then he goes, okay, I'm going to meet Esau. And so then what does Jacob do? He first sends he sends his family over the river and all his possessions. He sends everything that he can hide behind. As a moocher, he's been hiding behind other people from the beginning. When he's born, he's hiding behind Esau, hanging on to him, holding on to him, mooching off of him. Then he hides behind mama, and he's holding on to her. Then he hides behind his uncle, and he's holding on to her. Then he hides behind Rachel, and he's holding on to her. And when he meets God, he intentionally sends everything he can hide behind away. And God shows up and is like, it's you and me, buddy. And he wrestles with God all night. And in the end, he has a new name, Israel, to fight or contend with God. Like his grandfather, who goes from Abram to Abraham, Jacob is given a new identity by his creator. Then, just like Abraham, he grows in this identity. So after he wrestles with God and gets this new name, this new identity, the rest of the story is him growing into this identity slowly over time. And what you start to see is you start to see his habits change bit by bit. You even see his language change. And the greatest change that he finally stops playing favorites. Most of us overlook this when we read the story, but he finally stops playing favorites and he starts caring for all of his children as an entire family. For example, when Benjamin, his other child with Rachel, remember Rachel dies, Joseph is carried off, and all he has is Benjamin, and he's hanging on to little Benji. Oh, my little Benjamin. He's hanging on to him. And the other sons sort of accept. They finally come to the point in the text, this man will never love us. He will favor Benjamin over us. And you just feel bad for Leah's sons. You see this in the text. But then here's what happens. We overlook this part. When Benjamin is summoned to Egypt after Simeon, one of Leah's sons. So you remember Jacob's sons, they go to Egypt because there's a famine. They go for grain and they meet Joseph. And then Joseph takes Simeon and has him put in jail. And then says, go back and bring me Benjamin and any other brothers you have. And so they plead with Jacob. You remember this? They said, no, we had a brother, please, Benjamin's the only one left. He's the son our father really loves. If he loses him, his world will fall apart. And Joseph says, I don't care. Either you bring me him or your brother rots in an Egyptian prison. And so they go to Jacob and they tell Jacob what happens. And then this is the part we skip over. Listen to what Jacob says. He says first to the boys, he says, you have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon, Leah's son, is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me. We overlook. In the first, he doesn't care about Leah. He doesn't care about her kids. And now all of a sudden, Simeon's in jail. And he mentions Simeon by name and he says, first says, Joseph is no more and Simeon is no more. Joseph becomes a father at the end of the story who cares for all of his children. And the reason for this care is because of God who stays with him as he promised. God stays with Jacob even when he mistreats Leah. He stays with Jacob even though he leaves his daughter. He stays with Jacob even though he favors Joseph and messes up Joseph's life. God remains with Jacob and changes him from a schemer to a patriarch. Jacob becomes worthy of the blessing he's been given. And this brings to mind a quote from, he's one of my favorite philosophers from Kenya, Dr. Palau Lumumba. He says, God never calls the qualified. He always qualifies those that he has called. And that's what Jacob shows. Jacob is far from qualified, and yet God qualifies him. Though deeply unfair and infuriating to us, the story of Jacob shows the reality and the richness of grace. Grace is never fair. It is a gift that God freely gives, and it's not because of how upright and responsible that we are. Perhaps this is why God did not approve of Esau. It says, I hate Esau, but it actually is, I don't approve of Esau. Jacob, I approve of. Esau, I don't. And to us, it makes no sense. But when you put it in light of grace, Esau's nature, which is positive, could have made himself righteous. Esau might have thought of himself as good and seen grace as a reward. I'm bringing daddy, wild game. I'm the responsible golden boy. I'm working hard, so I deserve God's favor. But Jacob, on the other hand, he's the perfect candidate to see it as a gift. Jacob knows he's a scoundrel. Jacob knows he's messed up. He admits it throughout his story. But yet, when God presents his grace, every time, Jacob freely takes it. What I love about the Jacob story, as angry as it makes me, is not once is Jacob trying to earn anything from God. God gives him grace, and Jacob takes it up and keeps going. And that grace, through that grace, God shapes his life, redeems him, and makes him right over time. What Jacob does is shows us, in the end, how we really are. For none of us can claim that we are better than him. I always remind myself of this. Yeah, Jacob has done far worse than I would do, but I'm still no better than him. In many ways, we are all scammers and schemers with an agenda. But God's agenda, which is to transform us, disrupts our lives for the better. And the same is true for the creation, which is broken by sin. God has been, since the fall in the Garden of Eden, he has been working to transform all of this by grace. And while doing so, he's never called creation bad. Say it again. He always sees it as good and worth the work to save it. So that is all I have. Are there any questions, comments, thoughts? What do you think?
I would like to know, how do you see, or do you see it in the way that I have learned to see, in the end, Jacob adopts Joseph's children?
Yep.
How do you see that? How do you interpret that?
That he adopts them?
Yeah, why would he was their grandfather, but he wanted to be their father.
Yes, so what it is it's interesting. Jacob, he ends up getting what he wants in the end, in a way. He ends up getting what he wants, kind of. Because Joseph, this is the other thing. Remember, God qualifies whom he has called. Jacob tries to qualify Joseph, and God goes, no. It's not going to be by your standards. It's going to be by mine. And in the end, Joseph is qualified because of what God allows him to go through. And Jacob, embracing those sons, it's embracing this new reality. It's embracing God's will in all of this. It's beautiful. It is Jacob letting go of his agenda. Never would he imagine that he'd be doing this. It's also a way of, remember, Joseph is dead. They've mourned him, he's gone. They've had the funeral. And so this is a way of bringing Joseph back in as well, acknowledging that he's alive and restored. It's very beautiful. Oh, thank you for mentioning that.
I always like that Jacob wants to be buried with Leah.
Mm-hmm.
And not.
Yeah. Yeah. You notice the shift.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, and I'll say this, the story of Jacob frustrates me. Because it frustrates me because it takes so long for him to change. It takes so long for him to get this right. But then in the end, I start off reading it mad, and then I end going, a little calmer. He's buried with Leah, the wife that he rejects. He gives up his own agenda and accepts God's will. Another thing that he does is, before he dies, he steps down and he lets Joseph take over. So even though he's worse than Abraham and Isaac, he ends up in the end far better off than they did. Isaac never lets go of his agenda. Abraham never lets go of his agenda. From what we can see. But Jacob does. And in the end, he lets Joseph have the seed of honor. Anyone else?
It's almost like a conversion experience.
Yeah.
Like for instance, family that has 4 kids and one has a very dramatic conversion. The other has always been Mr. Goody Two Shoes.
Yeah.
And then it's less.
Yeah.
less
What's interesting is that you see how salvation works. That you see it's not the same for everyone. So it's like this, in the Western Church, Protestant, Catholic, we see salvation play out in a different way than the Eastern Orthodox Christians. We see in the West, we see salvation. I'll write it down. Salvation. The first way that it works, I'll write in blue. The first way salvation works, and we see this with Abraham, is that you believe, then you behave, and then you belong. And you see this in the book of Hebrews. It says, Abraham by faith, he believes, then he behaves, and then he belongs. But then in the Eastern churches, and they see salvation as working the other way. First you belong, then you behave, and then you believe. And this is Jacob. So Abraham, it shows, we see this in his story. The salvation comes this way. But then in the story of Jacob, we see that it goes in reverse. And in the Eastern church, this is how they would see it working. And this can help us with our evangelism. Because for some people, you can win them over, or some people will come to faith, through this. We present the gospel, we present the argument, and they go, okay, I believe this. And then you invite them to church. And they follow our way, and they belong. But then there are others, you meet others who say the arguments aren't going to win me over. You go, okay, well then at least come to church with me. At least come to Christian communion with me, to events. And they experience our life and our hospitality, and as they're around us, they behave, and then they believe. And the patriarchs show us this.
I have a question regarding his struggles with God. We talk a lot of other details. What did that mean in that night? What did he do? He talked. He fight. What?
With God? He fights with him. That's just it. He wrestles with him. We don't know the details. All it says is he physically fought with God, and he didn't know that he was fighting with God. It says this man. So Jacob is sitting there by himself, and then all of a sudden this man comes out of nowhere, and Jacob's impulse, if some mysterious person comes out of an alley, the first thing you're going to do naturally is fight back. And so Jacob is wrestling with this mysterious guy all night. And then he only starts talking at daybreak. At daybreak, he realizes, the guy's like, let me go, for the day is coming. And then Jacob somehow in this realizes, oh, this mysterious man is the angel of the Lord, is God. And so then he goes, okay, God, I won't let you go until you bless me. And this is when the talking comes in. I won't let you go until you bless me. And then he says, and then the angel blesses him, but then also injures his hip. And he walks with a limp for the rest of his life. And there's a tradition in the church, actually, when you are baptized, or when we have these important ceremonies, there's a little bit of pain that comes in with it. So it used to be, when you were baptized, the pastor or the priest would slap you across the face so that you would remember. And this points back to Jacob wrestling. Yeah, you can't do that. I wouldn't even know. But there are some churches where they baptize the infant and then they go on the infant. Yeah, I've seen that. But no, we don't do that. But what Jacob does, though, is it's mostly just wrestling. He doesn't know that it's God until daybreak. And then when he realizes who it is, he doesn't ask questions. He just says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. I won't let you go until you bless me. I will not let you go until you bless me. And God goes, okay.
And he had received the blessing already in the wrong way.
Yeah.
So he knew that was not the real blessing.
Yeah. And I think this is the point where he learns about grace. He learns just because you've wrestled with God all night doesn't mean you've earned anything. You can't, by your merit, by your works, make God do anything. God made his promise, and God will be faithful to it. God's already blessed you, Jacob. And it's only at that point that he gets it. It's like you're saying, he steals the blessing first. Or he thinks he's stolen it. He thinks he's earned it through his cunning and his scheming. And then he gets to the desert and God goes, no, that's not how it works. And when Jacob realizes that, Jacob holds on to God. And I think that's also the point too, is one of the church fathers said this. He said that Jacob at this point also was afraid of God. He knew what he did was wrong. And actually Jacob, he's on the run. He's on the run from God, and he's on the run from his brother. And he fears judgment. And so when this guy shows up, he also thinks that maybe this is somebody that Esau has sent to kill him. And then he starts wrestling, and then he realizes it's God. And then he realizes, wait a minute, God hasn't killed me. God hasn't degraded me. God hasn't cast me aside. I'm still here. He gets a different picture of God in that experience than he imagined. And so he goes, so okay, I'm seeing how good you are, then I will not let you go until you bless me.
Probably that's also the change.
Yeah, the change. Oh, yeah.
Because Jacob became an upright person, both with himself and
Yep.
with God.
Yes.
And that made the situation so precious.
Yeah.
Because only at that moment God could wrestle with him.
Yeah.
And the wrestling, was like a painful experience. So
Yeah.
he got hit, which is like a depiction of, you have to take some hits.
Yeah.
But he came out with a new name and a new future.
Yeah.
So being upright means you get a new future probably if you're upright with yourself and with God. That's
Yeah.
a very positive thing.
Yeah. And the thing is also, when you're limping like Jacob, you can't run anymore. You can't be he had been on the run. He had been running since he left home. And now God says, you're not going to run anymore. And then right after that, he makes peace with Esau. First he makes peace with God. Then he makes peace, he reconciles with his brother, makes peace with his brother. And then he literally is not on the run anymore. Jacob faces God, and then God is with him when he faces his sins, his problems, and then he has peace.